Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for May 2015, F1 Sopwith Camel project with Tom Koruza. Tom has spent over 10 years collecting parts and manufacturing a F1 Sopwith Camel, just like they made it back in 1917. We also have updates on the state of Michigan's WW1 Centennial Commission, and we have, of course, what happened 100 years ago during the Great War during May of 1915. And now a Michigan's WW1 Centennial Project update from Lansing. State Senator Rebekah Warren will introduce legislation into the Senate for the formation of a WW1 Centennial Commission. In the State Assembly, Assemblyman Adam Zemke will do the same. Both of these legislators are from Ann Arbor. Sometime in the future, the Senate and the House will vote on the measures, and Michigan will finally join the ranks of other states that have a WW1 Centennial Commission. One century ago this month, May 1st, 1915, a German U-boat sinks the first American merchant ship, the tanker Gulf Flight, in the Mediterranean Sea near Sicily. On May 2nd, on the Eastern Front, a combined Austro-German offensive begins against the Russian Third Army at Tarnów and Gorlice in Galicia. The attack preceded by a massive artillery bombardment with over 700,000 shells. This breaks down the defenses of the weakened Russians, who now suffer from a shortage of artillery shells and rifles. Within 2 days, the Austro-Germans break through the lines and the Russians begin a disorganized retreat. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoes the British passenger liner Lusitania off the Irish coast. It sinks in 18 minutes, drowning 1,100 persons, including 128 Americans. President Wilson subsequently sends 4 diplomatic protests to Germany. At the time, the Germans claimed that the Lusitania was a combatant ship because she was carrying munitions for the war effort for Great Britain, which turned out to be true. Then on May 9, 1915, following 6 days of artillery bombardment by over 1,000 French guns, the French 10th Army attacks the German defensive lines in the Artois, advancing towards Vimy Ridge. The French achieved their initial objective but failed to capitalize on the narrow breach they created in the German lines. The next day, the Germans counterattacked and pushed the French back. Also on May 9th, complementing the French attack at Vimy, the British and Indian troops launched their second attacks against the Germans around Neuve-Chapelle. However, without sufficient artillery support to weaken the German front-line defenses, the advancing soldiers are decimated by German machine gun fire. The attack is called off the next day, with 11,000 casualties. May 15th, British and Indian troops launched another attack against the Germans in the Artois, this time at Festenberg, north of Neuve-Chapelle. The attack is preceded by a 60-hour artillery bombardment, but the troops advanced just 1,000 yards while suffering 16,000 casualties. On May 23rd, at an airfield near Berlin, Anthony Fokker demonstrated his new revolutionary airplane, the Eindecker. What made it revolutionary was it had a synchronized machine gun, which allowed it to shoot through the propeller without hitting the propeller. The Eindecker granted German air service a degree of air superiority from July 1915 until early 1916. This period was known as the Fokker Scourge. Also on May 23rd, Italy declares war on Austria-Hungary. On May 31st, the first Zeppelin raid on London took place, killing 28 people and wounding 60 people. The Zeppelin attacks on London and other cities continued throughout the war. Even though these attacks did not cause much loss of life or property damage, it still could inflict on the civilian population of a country death and destruction from above, marking a new era in warfare.
I could have easily gone with metric or gone with SAE, but to me it wouldn't be right. You know, for when I'm finished with this airplane, I intend for it, except for time and space, it's going to be a real Sopwith Camel. Right down to the original glue, the paint, the Irish linen, the threads on the nuts and bolts. I mean, everything right to the last detail that I'm taking no exceptions. You know, I'm a nut for authenticity. Pocket watch, but it doesn't have a hole in the stem.
Right.
And did some research on it and discovered it. Yeah, it's a clock mount for a Sopwith Camel, and the clock was an interesting part because it was the most valuable piece on the airplane. It had the clock and you crashed, you'd be court-martialed if you came back without that. I mean, you had to take that out of the airplane and bring it back. And I thought, well, I wonder if I can find the rest of the instruments. So I started looking, and over the course of 10 years I found each and every correct and original instrument for the airplane, to include this, which is a data plate with a serial number for a Sopwith Camel. So once I had the data, the instrument panel done, I never planned on building the airplane. I've built 4 other experimental airplanes, and I thought, well, now I have the panel, it would be neat if I could find some other parts for it. So I was at an EAA meeting at one of our local EAA chapters, and one of the guys, an older guy, said that, hey, I have an engine for a World War I airplane. And nobody believed him, I didn't believe him. And we set up a meeting and arranged it. We came up and I found the engine was pre-World War I. It was what's called a Gnome Omega, which the Omega was the very first rotary aircraft engine. It was the very first production aircraft engine. And it was as important to aviation as anesthesia is to medicine. The Gnome Omega, it allowed flying machines to become aircraft, because before that all they had was the Wright brothers, 1903 to 1907. The Wright brothers, real primitive engines, and planes could just barely hop off the ground, and they were primitive flying machines. In 1907, when the Omega came out, it set 37 world records, I mean, for altitude and airspeed, and it just allowed these flying machines to really become aircraft. Very rare and valuable engine, but it was pretty damaged. It had some bad pistons in it, and it was a complex little engine design that had actually valves in the crown of the piston. So I spent a couple of years going through that and restoring that engine and getting it to run. And when I finally got it running, I took it to Oshkosh, and I took it to Dayton, and I had it in a couple of major shows, and I ran it on this very stand here. And after it ran, all the guys who I've been dealing with parts with now that are my best buddies are like, hey Tom, do you want to buy and trade some parts? So that allowed me to really get a foothold in to get the rest of the parts I needed for a Camel. But I never dreamed I'd get an engine, because the engines for a Camel are extremely rare. And then one day I got a call from a museum in Paris who said, hey, we want your Gnome engine because we're going to put it on a Blériot and fly it across the channel. I said, well, I'll trade for one of your Camel engines, because I knew they had several Camel engines. And they said, no, that won't happen. And I said, well, then you won't get the engine. Well, a year later they called me up and said, okay, we'll do the trade. So I traded the 7-cylinder Gnome Omega for what we have here. So now I have a complete instrument panel with data plate and an engine. So I have to build the airplane. There's no choice. I didn't want to. I have to. This is the Rotherham air pump, a hand pump, and this is a Rotherham pump for the aircraft. They couldn't figure out how to put a fuel pump on a rotary engine, so what they did was pressurize the fuel tank. So you started on the ground by pressurizing it here with this air pump. Would get about 2 pounds of air pressure in here, and you'd adjust it with this relief valve. And then once the engine was running, it would turn this propeller out on the strut, which would provide air pressure for the fuel tanks. And there's no real carburetor in it, so any fluctuation in this air pressure is immediately sensed in the engine. So they always said the Sopwith Camel was a difficult airplane to fly. It wasn't difficult to fly. It flew like a Piper Cub. The problem was you had to manage all these systems. You had to fly an airplane that was, Piper Cub, as in today's standards, is actually a little bit more difficult as a tail dragger. Most people fly a tricycle gear airplane, but conventional gear aircraft, tightly coupled, with a rotary engine with a lot of mass, working with the air pressure system. This is the throttle control system. This would control the air valve. This controls the mixture. They call that a Tampier valve. And so in order to move all that at one time while being shot at and fly an airplane when you only have about 20 hours of flight time, that's why it was dangerous, because a lot of people got hurt in these airplanes. The engine that I got is a very interesting engine because I have the original information from it here. It was produced in July 1917 by Clerget in Paris, and it was stored at an airfield at Toulouse-Lenoble Airfield west of Paris during the Great War. I just find it interesting to tell young people today that the Great War, like, well, what do you mean the Great War? Wasn't it World War I? Well, it was, but until then it was the war. So during World War I they didn't use the engine, it just stayed in the stores. And then after the war it went to a training unit, which was held at Airport Pau Pyrenees, where it remained in its crate for quite some number of years. In 1937, a guy named Jean-Baptiste Elise purchased the engine and moved it to Cerny-le-Fert-Elise airfield, where in 1939, of course, the Germans took over, and actually they based Stukas at that airfield. So they had to hide the engine and the other engines that he had from the Germans, because that, 400 pounds of steel would make a lot of Stuka parts melt it down. So they hid it from the Germans, and then in the late 60s, Jean-Baptiste created a museum for restoration of aircraft. And then I think in around 2000 he installed this on a Morane Saunier and run it for about 20 hours. And then they have what's called take it apart and inspect the rings and clean out the oil galleys from the castor oil. And that's when they took the engine off, and it hasn't run since. So now that I have it, it's been completely restored in 2014, and it's the only airworthy Clerget in the United States. Sopwith Camel Clerget engine. It's 130 horsepower. It swings a 9-foot prop. That's English walnut. And everything you see there is original, except the propeller is newly made, but the engine is all complete and original. You see the stamping on that propeller. I actually have another engine, a Gnome 160 Gnome, and that prop was designed for that engine. So it's a little bit too much pitch for this engine, but not bad. It's very close. It's within a couple millimeters where it should be. I'm having another one made specifically for this engine, but a left or a right like a normal engine would. It's got an oil pump here, and the oil pump, every 12 revolutions of the engine, the oil pump will put one shot of oil into the rear main bearing and into the front main bearing and then out into the exhaust. So it's a total loss oil system where you lose a quart every 15 minutes. This is the air intake, and this is the block tube carburetor, real primitive carburetor. It just basically is a slide valve with a needle valve on the end of it. And it'll adjust the RPM from maybe 700 to 1200 RPM, but that's not enough of a range to really fly an aircraft effectively, so they added what's called a coupe switch or a blip switch on the yoke. And what that would do is you get the engine set so it's running just right where you think this is good to go, and then you'll blip the engine. You'll actually shut it off. You'll turn the magnetos off to slow it down to come in for a landing. So it's equivalent to driving your car with your gas pedal to the floor and just using the key to slow yourself down. It just, when you hear the World War I airplane engines, that's that distinctive sound. The copper plating is not for looks, but a necessity in the production of the engine parts. I can show you here one of the rocker arms. How worn out this is. This is the engine's worn. How could that be over just 20 hours? But that's not it. This is actually a new rocker arm that hasn't been used. That's the design of that hole. So what it is instead of pivoting on a circular point, it pivots on a point inside there similar to this, where the little point rides in that little recess in the bottom, so it truly does rock. So it's a zero friction rocker arm, and then you can get oil in there. So it's a very interesting design. But when they did that, that puts a lot of stress and pressure right on that little point. So what they had to do was harden it and heat treat it. But what they found when they hardened it and heat treated it, it would cause the outer portions to crack. So what they did was they'd copper plate it and then bore this out, heat treat it, so then only the center of this took hardening, and the rest of it stayed mild and wouldn't crack. So it was pretty ingenious. I put new valve guides in here, that little guide for the exhaust valve, just because that was a part that really tended to get a lot of wear. Interesting thing, it's a French engine, so it has all the parts are metric, so all the nuts and bolts are metric. But the problem is, in 1917, they didn't have what's called ISO. I don't know if you're familiar with what ISO is. It's a standard of production where if I build nuts and you'll build bolts, they'll work. And back then they didn't have that. So the problem is, every one of these nuts and bolts will only go where it goes there, and I actually have to make metric tools that are just about 5 millimeters, just about 5 millimeters, a little more, and a little less, so I can get in here and every nut and bolt is handmade. So, and everything weighs within 5 grams of itself, because you see the whole engine rotates, turns, and in that turning at 1200 RPM, if it's out of balance, it'll really wobble. So you can balance a nickel on one of the cylinders, and it'll cause it to rotate. You have to have it balanced within 5 grams. Everything has a serial number and a part number on it. It's really rare to find a motor of that caliber, that clean engine, or metric. But on the airplane, they're what are called British Standard, or BA nuts and bolts. So there's quarter BA and quarter BSF. Now those, they're not quite SAE and they're not quite metric. SAE nut would be maybe a 1032. Well, in British Standard, it's a 1031. So it's just one thread off over the course of an inch, but it's different. So that's the kind of nuts and bolts I'm using in the aircraft, and because they're not produced anymore, I'm having them made. So I have octagon bar stock that every nut and bolt for this airplane is made. I could have easily gone with metric or gone with SAE, but to me it wouldn't be right. When you look at them, to their face value, they look like it, but there were a lot of these that were made by the U.S., so it's a different gun, and you can tell by the serial numbers and the part numbers on them. So when you look close, you can see that what are called VSM numbers on this, which means this is a real Vickers from 1917, not just a mock-up or one made from World War II parts. It's very authentic. This is the interrupter gear. This was when the Sopwith Camel was made, it was the F-35 of its day. I mean, it was the space shuttle of its time. It was one of the greatest fighters of the war, and shot down the most airplanes. And this was an interrupter gear from a Gnome powered Camel, and this at the time was a top secret part. It's how they kept the Vickers from shooting the propeller off the airplane. This is a little bump here and a little bump here connected to what are called Bowden cables, and then when this rotates, those bumps go up and down and cause the Vickers to stop firing when the propeller was in the way. This is an Adelis sight, and the British Adelis sights were very sought after because they figured out how to make them not fog up inside. The Germans would always fog up and they couldn't use them, but the British, what they did is they had these little holes here, and they drilled them and filled them up with nitrogen, so then they wouldn't get foggy inside, and you could sight through it and see enemy aircraft. All the parts I'm using on it are original. This is an original pitot-static gauge, pitot-static port, and using the magnetos, 2 magnetos. This is an oil pulsometer. Oil will pulse in here and tell you how much oil you have in the engine and that the oil pump's working. Tach, altimeter, compass, and that gets filled with kerosene, airspeed clock, and then the pressure gauge, and a correction card. It's got a really interesting fuse on the front of it. Take this off. This is a protective cover for transportation. And the fuse is this propeller. You'll cut this wire, mount it on the airplane, and a little blade will go here and keep this from spinning. When it's released, when the pin releases here, this starts dropping. This will spin, and once it gets up to speed, inside here there's a clockwork mechanism with several plates with holes in them, and those plates will slowly turn and come around and line up the holes till the holes are lined up, and then this pin will be able to push in and light the ignite the fuse. So it's an amazing clockwork mechanism in there for a 100-year-old bomb. clipped on here, and they would use this to turn on the different lights to fly it at night, because the Zeppelins would come over, the German Zeppelins would do bombing raids, and this is the only thing they had to defend against it. Some of these instruments have little dots on them that are iridium, so it's radioactive. It's really like a big model airplane, built very similar to how you build a model, just put the sticks together. The big difference is there's no glue used and there's no screws used to hold it together. It's all held together by little clips and these wires. The clips look like this, and it's just a socket that the cross members fit into, and then the wires draw everything together with these turnbuckles. All these turnbuckles are original Sopwith Camel turnbuckles from 1917. The clips are new and the wood is new, and the wires are new. So it's as many original parts as I can get I'm using. What I was working on here today is this is the axle fairing. So I've got to move this front edge down. That's what I'm working on doing that now. But the axles rotate up like this. That gives it the suspension, and a bungee goes through here and gives you the softens out the ride. These are the wheels, and I had to find a wheel that I could find rubber tires for and be able to use it. So the 1917 Model T Ford smooth tire is within a few millimeters of the right diameter and width of an original Sopwith Camel tire. So I bought those. I bought rims that were unpunched. There were no holes in them for spokes, and I sent it to a bicycle shop, motorcycle shop, and had them put the proper spoke pattern in for a Camel. And then they get, this is a cover over the top of it, that's just a fabric cover. And that's why the holes are drilled here for clips to cover them up. A lot of guys, you see them, like I noticed in one of your movies I saw, they were building a spat, and they were putting aluminum, screwing aluminum covers over this, and that's not at all correct. I mean, you can see the spokes through the fabric. I mean, that's the way it should look with the fabric on there. That's the Shuttleworth in England. They're building one at the same time I am, and theirs a little bit further ahead of me, so they've got theirs up on the gear, but mine should be up on the gear here in another month, I hope. Let me pull it out. I could buy streamlined tubing over here for struts for, say, a Piper Supercut would be very close to this shape. They're not the exact shape. So I found a guy in Europe who has the original rollers from Sopwith, and I had 10 feet of this tubing rolled in order to make this landing gear leg. So that's the original section tubing, done on the original rollers in new tubing. So both landing gear legs are done. Parts are back here. These are the fuel tanks. This is the main pressurized fuel tank, and it has a bronze cap. And again, the cap has that unusual thread pattern in it, the 2B rib pattern. That's the pressurized tank. That's why it has the bulb sides. This is the oil tank, 5-gallon oil tank. And then this is the gravity tank that goes up behind the seat, sort of a backup to the pressurized tank. This is the cowling. It's a spun aluminum cowling with the engine turning in it, and they spin this on a large wooden buck from a piece of aluminum that's probably 10 feet in diameter. And when they spin it around the buck, it puts marks across here, and it also work hardens the aluminum. So when they put these engine turning marks in it, it actually takes a little bit of the hardening out of the aluminum, and it allows little grooves for the oil to gather in and give it some protection, because it didn't have alclad aluminum back then. It's got an original data plate on the front that talks about timing the engine with the propeller. And then this engine under here is a 160 Gnome. It's another rotary engine that I haven't gone through yet, but it's a 160 horse. And that one was sent to the United States in 1917 to an Army depot in Arkansas. They didn't use it during the war. Shell Oil Company took it in 1918 to do testing for different types of oils they're going to make, and they never ended up doing anything with it, because in 1920 they stopped using rotary engines. One of the engineers took it, kept it, gave it to his son, who gave it to his grandson, who I ended up purchasing it from, and so I have all the history on that engine. This is the original engine I planned on putting on the Camel, because it's about 500 of the Sopwith Camels actually had these engines on it. And this is a little more common. There's several of these in the United States running today. They use them up at Rhinebeck quite a bit. And but it's a big engine. It's a lot of engine for the Camel, and it's friends I've known who've flown Camels with this engine on it say it's a handful. So I'm glad to find the smaller, more standard engine. Cut out a square brass plate and have it engraved, but you can see this is anti-ing. It stands up. It's not a typical engraving, so it's very difficult to make it look accurate. If you don't have the real thing, it's hard to fake it. People would see it and not know what it is and throw it away. Whereas, you know, a compass or an airspeed indicator or something that says Sopwith on it, oh yeah, that's, people will save that. But when you see something like this, you would never know it. You just have that as garbage in your backyard and throw it away. Cuts out the cuts out the engine, blips the engine. These are the left and right machine gun triggers. And then the yoke, this connects to the ailerons. This is a mounting point, and then the elevator will go up and down like that. But each and every little piece is just hand cut from a piece of steel and welded together into a streamlined shape, and it takes literally years to duplicate it exactly the way they did in World War I. This is a casting, aluminum casting, made from an original cloche handle in England. I had that, and these triggers cast from original.
And what's this?
Originally, when the Camel came from the factory, it had a white rubber coating molded onto here. And then when they rebuilt them in the field, they wrapped them with cord just as a grip, because the white rubber tended to just get crusty and fall off. That's the flag of the Royal Air Force. In 1918, before 1918, they were called the Royal Flying Corps, the RFC. After 1918, they became the Royal Air Force. And that's right about the time the Camel was there, so really the Camel is one of the first RAF aircraft, and that's still the symbol they use today. And you see there's the tail skid over there, that's the bottom of it. And this would dig into the ground and rotate. It would steer like that. But once I get the front mount on it, I can take it off this board and flip it over and put it on its landing gear.
How long is it going to take you to build the wings?
They'll go pretty quickly. I mean, I could have them done in a year. This is far more difficult than the wings. They're pretty more. The company that produces these is Brunton's in Scotland, and they were the original company that made those in 1917. So when I contacted them, all I had to do was give them the part number, the serial number of Sopwith F1, and they still had the drawings on hand to make. The axles are aluminum, which I don't get that. That's weird. See, I stamped the part numbers in them there, and they rotate. But to save weight in all things, I wouldn't save weight there, but that's what they did. So I made mine out of aluminum. This is the rear engine mount. This gets mounted right here. It goes between these two pieces, and the back of the engine will plug right into that. So if you can compare it to, this is a modern turnbuckle. See, it has a little notch and a groove in there for a modern clip. So that's how you can tell the difference between a reproduction and the real deal. My real ones are cleaned up. This is a set of reproductions that I bought that I may be forced to use them if I run out of originals, but these are all original. Around here like this and pivot. So that's the rudder bar. Again, far more complicated than need be.
Please don't forget National Doughnut Day. Mark your calendars. It's always the first Friday in June. This year will be June 5th. The Salvation Army started National Doughnut Day in 1938 to remind the public of their service during the First World War. It reminded the soldiers of the Salvation Army donut lassies who fried donuts near the front lines for the soldiers.